So next, I'm very excited and honored to introduce Professor Zhu Hua. And Professor Zhu Hua is the renowned expert in the field of language learning and intercultural communication, with a prolific record of publications on various aspects of multilingualism, intercultural pragmatics, identity, language learning, and language policy. She is currently the director of International Center for Intercultural Studies at the Institute of Education at UCL. She's also the chair of British Association for Applied Linguistics, a prestigious role that reflects her leadership and contribution to the discipline. In addition, she's an elected fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in the UK and an elected fellow of International Academy for Intercultural Research. Professor Zhu Hua has also held prominent positions at other institutions, such as chair of educational linguistics and director of the Mosaic Group for Research on Multilingualism at University of Birmingham. That was during 2020 to 2021. When she was professor of applied linguistics and communication, she also served as head of department and assistant dean at Birkbeck College, University of London. Professor Zhu Hua is a truly remarkable scholar who has made significant contributions to our understanding of language learning and intercultural communication in a globalized world. And please join me to give her your warmest welcome. Thank you very much, Professor Zhu Hua.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for your kind invitation, and also to Fumi's opening, Mari's opening speech. It's just so wonderful to be here and to be here witness, as Fumi said, this is a historical day, the launch of Cultural Competence Unit. And I learned so much from what you have said in the opening speech, and very much looking forward to hear more about your plan and your vision in the rest of the day. So I'm from, as Shangyu mentioned, I'm currently based in the LE Institute of Education, UCL. I'm heading up a relatively new center. It's really interesting to see this parallel development in different in university not far from each other. I think I was told by my son, who actually did a degree in UCL, King's and UCL kind of disagree, kind of disagree better kind of university in the current setup. Disagree better. Yes. And I'm delighted to be joined by my new colleague, Dr. David Wei Dai here, and he's actually contributing and teaching on our new MA Intercultural Communication. So the topic of today is promises and priorities in the cultural research. It's really an opportunity to reflect on the historical development, but also linking about what's relevant, the historical aims, objective, that's actually associated with intercultural studies, where things are now, what kind of relevance, if we are developing, investing in the intercultural studies or cultural competence, and looking at the new priorities, that's actually we need to consider for today. Sorry. So this is the headline. If people, probably several weeks ago, that dominated in the discussion. This is the debate about whether multiculturalism has failed or not. It's not necessarily a new debate. It's kind of reoccurring every now and then, because this is a debate that picked up by, was actually built on the previous debate, which again, on the previous debate about tension within the society. But then clearly, this is actually one of the area that's intercultural education, one of the subject field that linked up with intercultural studies are very close to. So this is really looking at these headlines and also looking at the nowadays conflict, what's happening now, the conflict, the war, and then the AI. It's all the headlines in these few days with AI summit is happening now in Britain. So why do we need intercultural research? Why we need to continue to invest time, energy, intellectual energy into this? So this is really looking at promises. What do we have promised as intercultural studies scholars and practitioners? Promises are kind of the quality of potential excellence, and then the also declaration of assurance that we will do something, and how relevant these promises our earlier predecessors who worked in the intercultural scholars, what promises they have made and where things are. So the first thing went back to a very popular textbook in intercultural studies. It's actually already, I think this is the 8th edition, but I think there are even 11th, 12th edition right now out there by two prominent researchers, scholars in intercultural communication studies. They talk about 6 historical imperatives that's actually connected with intercultural studies. So as you see, peace is first one, demographic diversity, economic competitiveness, technology, self-awareness, and ethics. I'll go through each one of them very quickly, looking at what exactly people are associated them for, where things are, what's the relevance. So the first one is peace. This is actually very much related to the early days when the intercultural studies or intercultural communication field was founded in the around 1950s. So that was just after Second World War when the cultures of enemies started talking to each other again. And was originally attributed to Edward Hall and others at the American Foreign Service Institute. But then historical work has actually discovered there are actually lots of early work, pioneer work before the official founding of this intercultural, the American Foreign Service Institute. It's really out of a consideration for national security and intercultural relations. So there are 2 bits. It's international relations, but also a concern for national security, so that we know better about the cultures of our enemies, and that will inform what's going on and preparation within the individual nation. And there are many organizations, charities set up, and CISV is one of the charities I worked very closely while I was based in Newcastle. As it happened, the international headquarters was based in Newcastle. The aim was actually found out back in 1950s is to promote peace, and starting from young age, and they set up international children's camp where they bring children as young as 11 together. They live together, and the idea is actually if we get to know each other earlier, the friendship will help us to overcome potential differences we see in each other. Now, later on, the intercultural has this idea of we need to work with differences has been picked up in various terms. One is intercultural dialogue. It was actually became one of the EU one of the underlying principle. They're talking about intercultural dialogue, and they were awarded a Nobel Prize because of this notion of intercultural dialogue. It is a social and very important to realize also political response to the need for intercultural communication and understanding in EU. And then later on, within UNESCO, global citizenship has recently become a new trendy notion to look at a commitment to humanist principles and respect for human equality and diversity. So if you look at the UNESCO global citizenship and peace education are very much actually closely related and still very much sort of the key agenda for UNESCO. Apart from the peace and conflict resolution and building shared understanding globally, the second imperative in Judith Martin and Kamarama's term is looking at demographic diversity. So it's really interesting to hear Fumin's thoughts about it's not just a global, but also about internal diversity. Intercultural study was founded not just about knowing others, but also knowing perceived different groups within each nation society. So social tension and relationship, looking at race, ethnicity, gender, and social class. And these some examples of work I found really inspiring, looking at these social tension and relationship within society. And it's very much also relevant to the first slide I have shown talking about multiculturalism within society, different tension within the society. Now, this is another very interesting intellectual work which I really enjoy, and particularly its relevance to the current debate on multiculturalism. This is by Bowman a little while ago, 1999. And this book is really about how different groups, people who think there should be unified culture, national culture, the group who actually think about cultural equivalent to ethnicity, and another group who actually think culture as religion identity. How these different groups can co-live together, and very much actually, sort of really relevant to the early discussion and how do we disagree better. And in Bowman's vision, he talking about recognizing the modern national state as a problematic creation and thinking about these identities as a process rather than a solid, bounded notion. So I think these discussions are very relevant to what the current debates we are seeing, looking at how do we actually live together, the tension between different groups, migrants in particular, how do we work together, coexist, and also the tension between different religious groups. And there is also a very important part of a debate that contributes to intercultural studies, that is indigenous social movement. So it's not just about social tension and social relations within sort of recognizable groups, but also about what's happened to the indigenous ethnic groups. And this is really important to bring in the discussion and reflecting. And if we look at the interculturally that, there is actually really, if people are familiar with interculturality, there has been lots of discussion, what exactly mean when people talk about interculturality. It's there has been lots of different interpretation on the same notion. And this article reminds us interculturality, the word and interpretation, doesn't belong to the West order, but it's actually up to debates, and it's really important to understand the other bit that's actually buried in the discussion. So the important message is actually if we follow the same rhetoric on interculturality, we are facing a risk of echoing the imperial order that the notion in another context attempt to overcome. So this is really an interesting discussion question, challenging how the interculturality, so-called interculturality, can bring a different negative aspect into the current discussion. Now, so the third imperative is, and perhaps if you have actually come across these kind of images promoted by HSBC at the airport, when you walk onto the airplane, they lined up alongside the boarding gate. So these are, I really think really clever of HSBC to promote intercultural differences as a part of the workplace. And here, intercultural, here is a while ago, people talked about what it's like to be an ideal global manager. Okay. So I think some of them also, perhaps also apply what it's like to be a colleague, students in an international university like King's, UCL, or any other workplace. And you need many different skills set and different frame of mind in order to be an efficient and effective international player in a team. And intercultural studies, therefore, is very much associated as very much regarded, can bring added value to the workplace, reputation, and economic benefits, and health communication. I know many of here are from health communication, crisis communication, as we have seen during the COVID, as we recovering from COVID. Intercultural studies have played a very important role in understanding the communication aspect of the health and crisis. And I know colleagues here based in other departments have actually looked into intercultural dynamics at workplace. For example, interviews. When you walk into the room, into an interview, and what has happened when you are talking about I don't really know very much about particular subject. How does that actually reflect on your ability? So these kind of intercultural encounters is part of the intercultural research remit, that understanding intercultural dynamics at workplace, and that consequently has an impact on the economic brand value, reputation, and benefits. Now, the next imperative, so the area intercultural studies have made a claim that we have made a contribution is technology. And this is very much, I guess, on everybody's the list of to look at, to follow, and particular nowadays with AI. For intercultural scholars, intercultural studies, with technology as a condition, but also a context in the sense now with the technology, intercultural communication becomes deteriorized on demand and routinized into everyday life. With digital, we are talking to people, from far away and on the daily basis, and also access to information is much more easier than before. So increased information about others, increased contact with people who are different from us, increased contact with one's own community and support groups. The contact have changed from many years ago when we're talking about you actually travel to a foreign country to meet somebody who look different or speak different languages. Now we live together, we can have access to people who are different from us instantly. So what does it mean? Looking at online communication, in what way it differs from in-person intercultural communication? Is there such thing called cultures of internet and also digital cultural identities? We are lots of people using WeChat or other Facebook, and we have sometimes we use a different name for our digital identity. What does it mean in terms of intercultural communication, and how AI impact on cultural values and what cultural AI looks like? So there are also debates, and I know we have a Digital Culture Institute here, so I'm just very aware I'm speaking in front of real experts in the room. So there are also debates about post-digital technology. Post means technology is part of our life, so there isn't any digital as versus human that dichotomy anymore. But it's very much actually we are one thing together, and this is very much up to debate. I'm not necessarily agree with this idea, but it's really just actually bring up here so that people may become aware. This is a debate that digital is now is part of the way we live, while forms, functions, and effect are no longer perceptible. And there is also, Elon Musk mentioned yesterday, AI pose real risk to humanities. And this is actually echoing the early work. The publication came out last year, looking at the X risk, so really serious risk humanities that potentially coming from AI. And one of them is a value lock-in. Here, the value is the value that's actually particular kind of value coming out from data that the AI is able to collect, which is English, published in a particular kind of domain, and they can accessible. And I think lack of diverse languages in AI data is real cause, is actually bring serious challenges to the diversity of a perspective in the in what we have seen in AI. Now, the other imperative, this is number 5 imperative, is perspective taking. So for many people who who are not first speaker, English speakers, we don't really speak English as first speakers, first language speakers, and you may actually share some of the experience by this is the Anna Wisbeka. She is a fantastic linguist and did fantastic work on cultural pragmatics. And this is her experience. When she started learning to speak English, she found herself shouting over the phone. And when she switched over from English to Polish, which is her first language, she found herself, she has to navigate, tone it down. I don't know how many of you shared a similar experience, but certainly these subtle differences, speaking different languages, when you're operating different languages, really, and also different languages seem to invoke different persona, is certainly some of the experience I recognize. Now, the last imperative is ethics. It's really about, I think this is a potential area that intercultural studies can really make a big difference. It's really about fully understanding tensions and oppositions. And particularly interesting, so the twist is ethics itself is cultural and political in itself. And judging, how do we judge ethics through values infused with ethics? So it sounds like, we're going around in circle, but this is a key question. Do we have universal criteria, values that we can use in ethics? Or when we're talking about ethics, where are the culture specific, the space we can actually create for the constructive discussion? And this particular kind of tension enables and also constrain creativity and stability in human society. So different forces we see. And ethics, this is my colleague's work, John O'Regan, who's based in UCL. He and with his co-author, they talk about ethic responsibility. So instead of talking about ethic, perhaps responsibility is a much more useful term that actually demonstrates a reflexive commitment to openness. And back to the intercultural digital ethic, and that's the real issue, a critical pressing issue we're facing. These are questions we have be asking: how do digital technology impact different cultural social groups differently, and how do these communities see these issues in digital ethics, such as privacy, consent, security, identity differently? And can we design digital framework that are tailored to ethical values of different cultures, while also harmonizing these frameworks at international level? So it is a big ask, and we need to actually create space to allow these differences, but also need to find a way to harmonize these frameworks at international level. And I tend to think this is perhaps a metaphor we can use, thinking about different plaques we have seen when we travel, how many different kinds of plaques electric plug we have to pack, and they're not compatible. It would be nice to have a way of harmonizing these differences, but also allowing different plug work to different devices. Do digital information technology represent new forms of colonialism and exploitation? And again, this is the last question that's actually we really need to embrace. Now, so what we have seen and learned so far is a promise of the ICC intercultural studies are very much driven, faceted, and is driven by social, economic, political factors. And there isn't actually one single factor, but reflecting the priorities of that particular time. If we are interested in culture of enemies, now with technology, things have a different priorities. But some of them are still relevant for contemporary society, but they may take on a different form, different questions, and we need to ask these questions about contact. What do you mean by interacting? What do you mean by intercultural contact? In what context? And thinking about ethics and knowledge. But what has been at the central stage of these inquiries is really about knowledge about others or increased contact. We have learned these increased contact does not necessarily lead to better intercultural communication. So this is a clear shift from the early assumptions when the intercultural communication as a study was founded. If we get to know each other, we have more knowledge, we are actually going to have a better result. What we have learned is not necessarily is a different equation we need to look at, and there are other factors. These assumptions seem to be, there are differences between groups, and these has been our founding assumptions underlying intercultural studies. And these assumptions we need to look into a bit more. And that's actually lead to my second part is actually, now we know intercultural studies are funded by understanding knowledge, trying to understanding the others, particularly from the differences. Where are the differences and how the knowledge about others can help us in different areas of work. But we need to looking at cultural differences, particularly from political point of view. Politics here is we're not talking about the governance, but more about social science understanding of politics is about how we can maximizing one's value preferences in various arenas by use of relevant available resources in competition with others and their resources. And how does politics and cultural differences factor in our studies and particular in achieving the goals and objectives of intercultural studies, which was founded to do many years ago. Now, the search for cultural differences are very, it is a bread butter focus of ICC. Here are some examples coming from language studies, applied linguistics, social linguistics studies, and language teaching. They're looking at how people speak differently, why do we actually say the same thing but mean differently in different cultures. And the silent language here referring to time and space, they are silent, but they matters in the way we communicate with each other. Okay. Now, the question is, who makes these cultural differences real? This has been asked, this question has been asked by intercultural studies scholars. And these are different terms describing the epistemic issues related to searching for the cultural differences. Some of you may have come across some of the terms before. I'm particularly struck by the notion of reification. So if we start with a problem as intercultural communication and you start looking at two groups, the assumptions of they are different, and that difference will be significant. And this difference is the most important defining aspect of social situation. So here we have a problem. If we start looking for differences, if you start with comparative and trying to find differences, we ended up with differences. But can we say the differences because they come from two different groups? And here is a really important epistemological question we need to ask, particularly within the intercultural communication studies. Reification culture, it creates division between cultural groups. And people have been asking about, are there questions to communicate across? And Sultan's work is particularly relevant. He was talking about not to define what culture is, but focus on what culture does, how it does. So in a way, it's very much aligned with what Shuangyi talked about, from knowing to doing, not just actually about what it is, but understanding how people do it. And not simply knowledge of differences, but rather an understanding how and why difference in language, thought, use of materials and behavior has come about. And in his own work, he talked about, interestingly, one thing that culture does is to create, instead of actually sort of helping us to overcome the difference, the notion, the very mention of culture actually creates a boundaries of class, ethnicity. So in a way, if we talk about culture, Chinese culture versus British culture, you are reifying this notion of culture and giving it validity of particular assumption, set of values, set of beliefs that is encapsulated within the label of Chineseness versus Britishness. So this is a quite philosophical, but also very important question for us to engage as intercultural communication scholars. I'm going to skip this one. Within social linguistics, Ingrid Piller, she has asked, without studying inequality and asking the question, what makes culture relevant to whom, in which context, for which purposes? Culture is nothing more than a convenient and lazy explanation. So the culture, the foundation of our field in the cultural studies, the notion of culture is really important. We actually need to step back to look at what we mean and why we are studying culture. And when we're talking about particular culture, are we ignoring the inequality and reifying the cultural groups? And I was struck by Jane Wooding when she came to give a talk in our center. She talked about, who talks about culture. Experienced culture are often felt by less powerful minorities, those who find themselves in a space where they're either treated differently, denied access, or legitimacy, affected by the enduring and constraining influences of social order. So when people talk about culture, they may have a different reason and they may have a different experience with a so-called cultural experience. And that's actually important for us to look into why particular group talk about culture, what for, and for what purposes. So I have talked about really important to look at priority, understanding, researching politics of cultural differences as priorities. Next, I will look at two case studies very quickly, very much drawing on my own experience of culture and expanding views of what intercultural research is about. One is really coming from language. As an applied linguist, I'm always very interested in how people use these different languages. So here is an image from Liu Yang, who's a visual artist. And this is a picture in her very lovely booklet. She was talking about East meets West. This is a booklet she composed, talking about the differences between different culture. And here, this is the Chinese, and that's the so-called German, and then she also expanded to the West. So when we're talking about the directness and indirectness, there are certain assumptions. Chinese tend to be associated with indirect, so the Chinese speakers do not say no directly. There are many different convoluted way of declining your invitation. If you ask her, can you do this for me, or can I borrow a book from you? And there is a so-called direct. In English speaking or other languages used in Europe, there is a tendency to speak, to use directness to say no. So when I was studying in intercultural pragmatics many years ago, we were taught, these differences, potential difference between East and West, directness or indirectness. And then later, when I came across this tweet, now, what do you think? This actually, there is really nice Twitter account called Very British Problems. He talk about, what do it mean when people talking about these different phrases? So what do you think these phrases have in common in English? Exactly. Yes, exactly. Thank you. So despite, various different ways, and the one thing these phrases have in common is potentially they are trying to tell you is no. Yeah. So what we have learned, about the solid differences, directness, indirectness between Chinese and then the rest of the world is no longer valid. If you look at English, the way we use English is also have many different expressions of saying no, either directly or indirectly. So what does it mean when we're actually learning to speak another language? It is really important to understand the cultural meaning of particular phrase, but also recognizing the importance of negotiating cultural meaning in situ. So when we actually hear somebody say this, we know most of the time, not necessarily all the time, but most of the time, we know what they mean from the context, the way they speak, the hesitation, the pause, and then what you know about this person, the relationship. So that prior knowledge and the context. So negotiating meaning in situ is really important. So knowing about these, potential cultural differences may or may not be helpful, but the skills of negotiating, navigating differences in situ seem to be a more important skill in the intercultural encounters. Okay. So another sort of case that have encouraged me to really reflect the so-called what is a cultural practice. During the COVID, you may remember these, how not to wear face masks. In the early days, you probably in the Chinese communities, people started wearing face masks fairly early. This is partly to do with when the COVID started, the Chinese community, and because of what happened in China, they naturally picked up this habit of face masks. But here, in the this is coming out from the one of research I carried out together with colleagues Rodney Jones and Sylvia Yobaska, who are based in University of Reading. So in the interview, when we asked about one of our participants, she talked about her experience of wearing face mask in the classroom, and her teacher told her there's no research so far that shows wearing face mask works. So please take it off. I need to see everyone's face clearly. Okay. So this is early stance from perhaps in the students feel is much more somebody from authority think about, we need more scientific evidence about this cultural practice of a face mask. And then the university senior management team also actually when they realized there was some tension about, people wear face mask and some people are less reluctant to wear face mask. And then in the early days, one of the senior management team member came out and said mask wearing by some students should be tolerated because it was part of their culture. So reducing something, later on we realize this is something we need to, because it's one of the measures of protecting others as well as protecting yourself. It's not just about protecting one's own, but it's more about stopping virus from spreading further. But reducing something as a cultural practice, it seems to delegitimate the value of some practice that turn out to be the practice that's actually endorsed later on. Here are some examples. But as things move on in the UK context, face masking become widely accepted. But there was a careful, I don't know whether people noticed, when Boris Johnson talking about face masking, he was talking about face covering rather than face masks. So all these examples, this is the example to show what is the kind of cultural practices or different practices is very political, underpin of about lots of other things, social, cultural factors, perceptions, and there is also hierarchy about whose practice is right or whose practice is better or more superior than the other practices, often regarded as labeled as particular cultural practices. So ways forward, I'm just wrapping up. So placing what culture is and what is not, it should be at the heart of what we do. Understanding, so we have a lovely, wonderful setup here, cultural competency, but may be useful to step back to look at what culture is and to discuss very openly and constructively our different understanding of what culture is. There are different interpretations of culture and they are all valid in that context. But when we work together, when we actually discuss, talking about share our understanding of cultural practices or what culture is, and we need to be aware of different perspectives, which is at heart of what we stand for as intercultural communication scholars. And what counts as culture or not is political, and that's really important. And there are politics of cultural difference that we need to be aware of, particular hidden power dynamics that comes with cultural practices. And here is going back to Gerd Bauman's work, looking at multicultural riddle. What I like about this particular code is looking at we need a theory of culture that understand differences as relational rather than absolute. So perhaps this, if you are people looking for solutions, this perhaps one way we can think about looking at cultural differences as relational, relative. Is something we negotiate, navigate in situ. I also was very much actually taken by Shuangyu and the colleagues here, the work on understanding and promoting a dynamic processual view about cultural competence. This is very much actually laid back to whether culture should be regarded as a solid boundary, but it should be more about process, dynamic construction. We navigate, negotiate as we learn. So Shuangyu is best positioned to discuss this. So I'm not going to go into the paper a bit more, but I'm just thinking this is a really interesting way as a response to the discussion about how do we overcome the reification problem that comes with when we're talking about different cultural groups. And going back to intercultural communication definition, the conventional definition looking at intercultural communication has been associated intercultural communication as studies both interaction between people from different cultural and ethnic backgrounds and comparative studies. And in my early work, I also refer to this definition. And I have been talking about intercultural communication as a process of negotiating meaning. But with my recent work, particularly my interest in looking at understanding politics differences, I'm moving towards looking at, instead of talking about negotiating I think we need to talk about navigating the differences, because in recognition, not everybody in the intercultural encounters are on equal footing or have access to the similar kind of access to information power. So we need to think about navigating relevance of cultural identities differences, and also very importantly, in addition to differences, we also need to think about similarities. So differences are important, but then similarity, what's in common, what actually can encourage is not just the differences, but more, I think it's important to recognize is the commonalities, similarities that encourage us to find each other in the same space. And I think that's most conducive to human flourishing. So I think I have more or less that's my the talk. Hope I have and then this is our center. If you want to follow up the work by our center, which is not far from here, and very much looking forward to future collaboration through these two centers and your cultural competency unit and our also relatively new center. I'm looking forward to the fruitful discussion we have today and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zhu Hua. There's a lot of fruitful thoughts. I think there's probably a lot of questions kind of burning in people's minds. So the floor is open to the colleagues down here. If you have any questions, please raise your hands and I'll pass the microphone to you so that we can kind of capture the discussion in the record as well. Do we have any questions?
All right, well, thank you for that interesting, informative presentation. I'm trying to read my notes. It's very scribbly here. So often people use inter and cross interchangeably when it comes to cultural research or communication research. I wonder whether you see a distinction between the inter and the cross, and whether that distinction is helpful or useful in any way.
I think, thank you. Yeah, that's a really, really important question. I think, I'm aware this is potentially open the kind of worm, but it's also relevant in our literature. So we have a cross, we have inter, we also have trans, we also have multi. So these prefixes all represent a particular kind of a priority that reflected in the development in the intercultural research scholarship. So cross was the originally was very sort of the label the intercultural communications field was started with. Cross referring to usually people using cross referring to comparative studies, and that was partly because in the early days there was it's not accessible in the sense you have to travel and find each other in perhaps in a foreign culture context. So that's actually when cross is used very often. Now with interculturality, intercultural communication became very popular. And I think intercultural, I'm very happy to use intercultural communication as an umbrella term to represent, including comparative studies, but also include the intercultural interactions when people talk, meet together and have a interaction with each other. Now, multi, talking about different cultural groups, and there has been some assumption, particularly in the European context, talking about multi, which usually imply there is very little interaction between different groups. And then we also have transcultural. Trans here has been used to very much actually drawing on perhaps from migration studies and the recent work about globalization. That's when people actually cross-border and became into more close contact into each other. And there is also some work looking at transcultural flow when people come into contact, different culture come into contact, new culture was developed. So trans has been used to representing what's new coming out of intercultural contact. And these terms are still under, in particular, trans, inter, are still under lots of debate and discussion. So that's a long answer to your question. Is that okay? Yeah.
Do we have another question? Yes, Jeff.
Thank you, Shengyu, and thank you, Professor Zhu Hua, for a wonderful presentation. I really a lot of food thought for me. So I'm particularly interested about when you discussed the culture dimension, the technology in culture studies, and also cultural differences. And as you said, a lot of currently with AI and everything. And obviously, according to my limited experience, lots of AI research are currently more started from scholars from data science and also computer science background. And it seems that not enough has been done from social science researchers. So my question would be is do you think any future directions, advices you would give us for scholars from social science background to either engage, also kind of engage with discussions, and what will be your suggestion? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. That's really, really important question. And that's something perhaps keep us awake at night, right? Or many people awake at night. And this is really interesting when it's partly to do with investment. And we see lots of money thrown in the discipline that actually can developing AI and using technology. And every day there is perhaps it's on the news about some new development looking at, and the other day talking about using AI as can help us to better detect some of the pattern in cancer treatment. So clearly there is benefits using AI if we can use it right in the right way. I think social sciences and us humanity scholars will come in here really important, because that if is really important. If we don't really actually come in and understand the social impact of technology, including AI, on society, on individuals' life, particularly on the agenda of inequality and social justice, there is a danger. I think the one slide I have showed people talking about X risk. X here is existential, real substantial risk to human being. And that kind of risk is really important to start early and to talk about how can we use AI technology ethically and in a way that actually help us to use AI to bring use AI to make our life better, but not necessarily to have a negative impact on the quality and equality of our society. And I think that's really important for the funding council to realize the value of social science and arts humanity, and that need to work together. So and I think it will come. It's just, I think it's a matter of time, particularly now, when we have this discourse about, right now as we speak, the AI summit is taking place. I think people are aware of these social ethical issues that comes with use of AI.
Thank you, Professor Zhu Hua. I actually have a question. So in your talk, I think there's a kind of a mentioning about cultural competency or intercultural studies being the process for us to understand how to navigate with the kind of a different culture processes, if you like. But recent years, I started reading about the critical theory, where you see that people, when they get into the cultural studies, they immediately recognize the suffering and the marginalization, so the problem in the society, which immediately foregrounds the differences. And I think this is a quite important part of the research in intercultural studies as well, because it gives people that kind of attention that's been overlooked in history. But on the flip side, it does not really help us in terms of creating a more harmonious society. Because in cultural competency studies, for example, in my research, a lot of times I was hoping to bring everybody together, thinking about how we can work collaboratively as kind of a unity. But that does not really help the individual groups to have their voices. So I'm just wondering what you're thinking in terms of kind of balancing these two different kind of groups and directions of research?
Thank you, Shangyu. And I think, again, it's a very important question. It's really about, how we can work together despite our differences. And that's actually one reason I have been thinking about how do we actually talk about differences, but also talk about similarities, commonalities. While we're talking about different, can we also try to find commonalities and similarities in our way of thinking, talking? And I think that's people sometimes think that's perhaps a transferable skills or transferable sort of connectivity. I think there is certain kind of transferable that's actually when trainings, skills that come from intercultural studies that can be applied to different disciplines. And that's why I particularly like, when you actually gave the introduction this morning talking about different disciplinary approach coming together and embedding the cultural thinking under each disciplinary training. And that's really important actually to embed the cultural thinking otherwise skills into each discipline. And similarities, looking at similarities, reflections, exchanging perspective is also very important part of these training. I don't know whether you have any thoughts on these. So this is kind of like throwing question back to you. Do you have any views how when you sort of setting up these cultural competence unit, what's your thinking behind sort of bring people together?
Yeah, thanks. I think we're absolutely practicing the kind of exchange here already. I think what's important in my kind of a part of the work is, as you said, the communication and keep the mind open. It's about changing the way to communicate the differences, not so much not to talk about it. So I've been kind of reflecting on the critical theories teaching where you identify marginalization and problems and suffering of people. And there are different ways of communicating that kind of a message without having to upset other people. So I think cultural competency may well be situated to kind of discuss what is the best way to communicate that message strongly so that people can hear from the marginalized, but at the same time, it creates a harmonious platform for discussion rather than the tension. A lot of the times, I think researchers, when they come in with a political agenda, which I think it's very difficult for all of us to shy away from, we have to think about how we're communicating that kind of a political agenda and intention in a friendly way. And I think we really have to reflect, as you said, as researchers, what is our social accountability? What do we want to do? Do we want to just kind of voice the needs of a marginalized group without thinking about how does that situate in the relationship with other kind of groups in society? Because we're not the only one who's marginalized. So I think communication is really key in this agenda, really. But behind it, I think there's a lot of kind of a baggage that we have to develop.
It's not really a question, but I just wanted to, I just had this burning desire to sort of come back from what you just mentioned. And I feel like, that's such an important point that I don't think I'd sort of fully come to realize about, that maybe the underlying problem is the real fundamental difference between sympathy and empathy. When you identify background traumas to an individual, to someone from a particular background, you understand perhaps that better, but it can in itself create a barrier, a negative barrier, partly perhaps because of that evoking feelings of sympathy rather than fully being able to put yourself or try to put yourself, attempt to understand and be curious about that other individual, because it also creates not only the sort of the negative connotations of sympathy, but also, or pity, all of those things are negative and they don't effectively engender, good shared communication. And I think coming from a clinician's perspective as well, I think there's also fear associated with communication if you understand perhaps the perspective a little bit more of a certain culture, but you feel worried about saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, communicating or saying something incorrect, and that can also create division, rather than, I suppose, the encouragement of curiosity. But anyway, I just wanted to pick up on what you'd said. It's so interesting. I've really enjoyed your talk. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that there's a very key message I learned from your feedback and comment is how do we kind of incorporate our feelings and emotions into this? Because it's so hard. We can be very rational, but we cannot stop us from feeling hurt, even if it's somebody saying something and it's kind of a constructed in the friendliest way. You know that you are hurt because what they're saying. And that's a very important part that cultural competency and intercultural studies may well have to deal with. And we are not good at dealing with that, I think, because not many of us aren't psychologists, for example. But maybe we just need them on board, or we need to learn some new tricks. I don't know.
Hi there. So my question, I formed it before, but it now feels like the right time to ask it when it's related to this. I obviously work at King's, and I'm here very much because I believe in our mission of making the world a better place. I think we're a very values-driven organisation, and something like cultural competency, I feel like myself and many of the colleagues that I know come at it from a values-driven point of view. Your presentation had a mixture of examples, including from HSBC. They featured twice as potentially getting it really right. And yet our politicians and some other examples from higher ed weren't. And I'm kind of curious to know your thoughts on that drive for financial benefit to be culturally competent, potentially fast-tracking that, as opposed to approaching it because it's the right thing to do and from a values-driven place. I'd just love to hear your thoughts a bit more on that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I think the economic benefit is one of the associated benefits when people are actually looking into intercultural studies. Is it going to be economic benefit? I know there are sort of perhaps people are more critical about this neoliberalism view towards seeing the sort of thinking about particular social and academic discipline. But I think it actually partly reflects is the practice-driven priorities coming from intercultural studies. It is actually set up as a very much a field of study that focus on practice. So it's the theory is implication, and one of the key principle of intercultural studies is learning by doing. So lots of emphasis on practices. Now, if we set aside these sort of neoliberalism criticism towards economic value of the enterprise, what we have seen is understanding intercultural interactions and making sure people can work effectively and efficiently, but also and building relationship. If we see that actually can bring indirectly to the economic benefits of a workplace. And I think here we have colleagues from different departments who has actually retired. Professor Celia Roberts, her work on the understanding the intercultural interviews that has a direct relevance of how we actually work with a diverse workplace. And my own PhD student, she actually graduated last year, also look at this cultural fitness discourse in the job seeking interviews. So when the organization asks a recruitment agency to identify cultural fit kind of a profile candidate for a particular job description, what does it mean? How is it really operationalized in the conversation, and particularly in the London context, when the interviewer or interviewees can have a very different mix of cultural background and linguistic background. So that's kind of thing will actually, if we have better understanding from with our skills, methodological, conceptual understanding coming from intercultural study and apply to understanding the intercultural dynamics at workplace, I think that will be bringing indirect benefits to economic value of a particular workplace. So I think, yeah, and that's actually sometimes can be useful argument as senior management team to look at, to invest resources into cultural competence unit. So that's, and Lumi will be our the VC. Perhaps she will have a lot to say later today about how at the university level, institution level, how intercultural, international and intercultural competence will actually bring added value to institute.
Absolutely, and I think I can totally echo that from the health and medicine perspective. And culture competence saves lives and saves money from the NHS, and that's why cultural competency has really been written in the medical curriculum for all future doctors to be trained on. And we have a kind of a team of people, colleagues, some of my colleagues from MedEd and here are kind of contributing to that journey as well.